Comfortably late. I want to welcome everyone here. First, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I also want to extend a warm welcome to a number of people who've travelled a long way to be here with us. Professor Gary Gumbert, Professor Sue Druckert, who've come from New York, Professor Miesa Christensen, who's come from Stockholm, Professor Lu Ye and her colleagues who have come from Shanghai. So thank you very much for making the journey to be here with us. Also, a number of people who have travelled from interstate. Dr. Amelia Barrington, where have you gone, Amelia? Right.
Click your fingers, tell them.
Who's been very much a part of some of the research endeavours that we're going to be discussing today. And Professor Ross Gibson, who tells us he's stuck in traffic on his way from the airport and should be here in a few minutes. I'm hoping you all have a chance to talk with all of these visitors. We can say a little bit more about how the day is going to run, but in the blurb for this event we said we're leaving a lot of open space with the idea that there can be a dialogue that takes place around some of these ideas. A couple of other things before I do a brief introduction. Dr. Alex Lambert from Monash University was going to be part of this event. Sadly, he's suffered a bereavement this week, and our thoughts are very much with Alex at this time, so he won't be taking part. And I did want to, first thing, pay huge thanks to Daniel Wire, who's done all of the heavy lifting in organising this event, in getting the facilities and bringing all the speakers here and making sure Nikos and I know what it is that we're actually doing today. So, thank you very much. This symposium is taking place at the completion of two extended research projects that Nikos Papastergiadis and I, who coordinated this symposium, have been involved in over the last few years. One on large screens, one on the idea of participatory public space. I'm hoping most of you will stay this afternoon and see the launch of two of the outcomes from those projects. It's an opportunity to have a glass of wine. We'll shift from here to the John Medley building. I guess what's important is the end of those formal research projects is certainly not the end of the research agenda for us. It's really about thinking about what we've learned so far and then having a dialogue with interested people about where we might take this research. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit, but I would stress this is a space in which we want dialogue to take place, so hopefully everybody will have the chance to contribute to setting the scene. The Participatory Public Space project was developed under the subtitle of The Right to the Networked City. And so a starting point was Henri Lefebvre's famous notion of the right to the city as a critical attribute of contemporary social democracy. And this is the idea that citizens, or more properly, that in order for inhabitants to become citizens, people need to have the capacity to shape the urban environment in which they live, the ability, in Lefebvre's terms, to appropriate the time and space of their surroundings. And he was wonderfully vague about what appropriation might mean. Anything from small-scale, bottom-up initiatives to a wholesale renovation of government, of technology, of politics, of life. What we're interested in examining in our project was the way the conditions for exercising the right to the city were changing in the context of ubiquitous digital networks. So this is the idea of it becoming the right to the networked city. Now clearly digital networks aren't the only things changing cities and public space. You can name a whole lot of other trajectories, new technologies from automobiles onwards, large-scale economic shifts around post-industrialisation, shift of manufacturing offshore from older industrial economies, neoliberal settings, changing the understanding and the role of the state, growing role of consumption as a dominant form of human sense giving, the impact of new mobilities, particularly different patterns of temporary inhabitation, and you could add a whole lot of other trajectories to this. So we weren't trying to think about the digital in isolation from these trajectories, but we were very interested in the way in which the digital provides new capacities for intense and iterative forms of feedback on urban processes as they occur. and in particular, the way that the digital threshold seemed to signal some fundamental changes to the process of how we encounter others in public space. And this seemed, and still seems to me, a really crucial space for understanding the dynamics of contemporary cities, how they might be reinvented, but also the new constraints or the new threats to the productive role of public space in the city. As soon as we start talking about the productive role of public space, this is a contentious issue. Because even without the kinds of changes we're facing in the present, public space has never been unproblematic. If public space is fundamentally a space conditioned by the idea of the common, a space in which we can all participate by definition, there's always been unevenness, inequality, friction, constraints that are both explicit and implicit. Long ago, in her book, The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt argued that public space is the space for the appearance of the political, the space for undertaking the fundamentally political acts of speaking and acting together as a public. I think this definition's really useful because it underlines a dual function of public space. On the one hand, it's both a site of struggle over what constitutes the public, but it's also a stake in that struggle. And this duality conditions the second theme, which has shaped the kind of research we've been doing in our research projects, and I think Nikos will talk to in his own way. The focus on public space as an experiential realm, as a zone of social encounter, which in the modern city means encounter between people characterised by diversity. Diversity of origins, diversity of cultural backgrounds, diversity of languages, beliefs, practices. Part of the argument that we bring into this idea of participatory public space is that the experience of social encounter is critical to the modern process of learning to exercise the right to the city. So it's not to say it's always a good or happy experience, but rather the process of learning to exercise the right to the city, of learning to be a citizen in a modern urban environment, isn't going to come entirely from ethical or political principles. It's going to arise from what Richard Sennett talks about as social skill, something that is derived from experience. Building public sociability in the sense that Sennett evokes is about building commonly held skills, which is to say skills held not by particular individuals, but held in common as relations between a collective of people who remain different from one another. And this focus on public space as a zone of experiential encounter leads to a third issue, which, while a lot of our research has been around the impact of digital networks, there's always been a dialogue with contemporary art practices. This is partly a reflection of the way that art has changed, particularly over the last couple of decades, so the shift away from the idea of art around finished objects or images to a kind of relational aesthetics. The movement of art practices outside of institutional environments, and particularly the leading role of artists in deploying digital technologies in innovative ways. These have all combined to make art a key zone for the development of experimental models for social interaction in public space. I think this is no doubt something we'll talk about more through the day. And going back to the idea, the difference that digital networks make to public space, there's been a huge amount of attention given in media and communication studies over the last decade or two about the transformation associated with the digital. Different production ecologies, different patterns, scales, territories of distribution, different forms of consumption, the altered role of those formerly known as the audience, a whole raft of issues around copyright, property, licensing, regulation, major challenges to the business models of so-called legacy media, who have certainly not disappeared, combined with the emergence of powerful new players. Our interest has been how these new conditions associated with digital platforms are impacting on public space. The concept of Geomedia, which is the title of my new book, is my attempt to grasp this condition as a new spatialisation of media in the city, and also a new centrality of the role of media in shaping urban spatial experience. And I'm thinking about this condition as the intersection of several key trajectories, mostly ubiquity, positionality, real-time feedback. I think these are relatively unproblematic terms in some ways now. So the idea of ubiquity of media has been debated a lot throughout the 20th century. In order to have access to media, in order to be connected, we needed to go to particular sites, the wired telephone, the television set in the living room, etc., etc. This has changed rapidly and decisively over the last decade, particularly with mobile, but also embedded forms of media throughout the urban landscape. The role of location, what I'm talking about as positionality, is also a major transformation over the last 15 or so years. Position is now one of the key filters shaping how we access information of all kinds, so thinking of positional search, but also the capacity to use place-aware devices in various ways. And this ability to access context-specific information in particular places really changes the use and value of that information. And the third trajectory is the idea of real time. This isn't itself new. There's a long history of media supporting synchronous real-time interaction throughout much of the 20th century with broadcasting. What's really different now is the way that the distributed architecture of digital networks enables this feedback to take place, not from a central broadcasting array, but from many to many, so that even as an event is unfolding, people can recursively or iteratively communicate to each other about what's taking place. Just got a couple of images. I don't know if anybody's going to spot this. This is a local event. It took place in September the 11th, 2000. A protest in opposition to the World Economic Forum, which was meeting in Melbourne then. Perhaps appropriately, the meeting was held at Crown Casino, which was a new complex at that time. There were a lot of protesters trying to surround the casino. If anybody knows Crown Casino, it's got a lot of entrance, it's a big environment. And the thing that struck me about that particular occasion, it was the first time I saw where protesters had enough mobile phones that they could coordinate their own action so that they could move from gateway to gateway in order to stop the police being able to get the delegates into the World Economic Forum. This new relation between digital media and public gathering, I think, has become far more evident in the 15 years since, and especially with the rise of social media platforms. So we saw significant public attention about this in 2011 with the so-called Arab Spring and the Occupy movements. Acknowledging this is not about hastily branding these events some kind of Facebook or Twitter revolution, as some commentators did, but it is to recognise that the capacity to cheaply and quickly coordinate mass public action is historically new, and it alters one of the long-standing constraints on public assembly. The rapid mobilisation of this kind was once the prerogative of highly centralised organisations like the police or the military. You had to have that sophisticated communication equipment to be able to mobilise in that. Now that capacity is increasingly available to other social actors. This leads on to a second point. Go back to the protest against the World Economic Forum in 2000. The protesters, as many activists have done over time, complained about slanted media coverage. So this has been a long theme, a narrow agenda of hostile mainstream media. And of course, slanted and narrow media coverage still exists, but a notable characteristic of recent protests, say over the last 5 years, has been the extent to which they're not just reported on by media professionals, but also by numerous participants who distribute their reports via websites, blogs, social media, online video, etc. So these new capacities for organising, for publishing and publicity, for recursive shaping of public events, I think creates a complex situation. This is an image from the Occupy Central protest in Hong Kong in 2014. All these people waving their lit-up mobile phones might be at a rock concert, but they're also holding network communication capacity. And this capacity now extends to being able to feed images back into the city itself as part of an event. People in Australia might remember this, the projection by boatpeople.org on the occasion of the Australian government deciding to turn back the ship MV Tampa, even though it was holding people claiming asylum in Australia in 2001. More recently, the so-called bat signal projected by Occupy Wall Street protesters on the Verizon building in New York. Or in 2013, the laser projections which showed the words "Morsi out, game over" on a building next to Tahrir Square during protests against President Morsi. These grew out of a lot of protesters using laser pens, firstly to identify snipers and to irritate police, and then as a form of public celebration, and then morphed into this kind of projection. And of course, projection is only one of the ways that there's new capacity to use digital media to intervene in shaping the ambience of public space. However, I'm not arguing that digital networks then is some kind of magic gateway to a more democratic culture. So-called mainstream media still have enormous power in defining and shaping public debate. A lot of the possibilities for organising through, say, social media platforms depend upon privately owned corporate networks that can often be shut down, making them highly susceptible to political intervention. And of course, the other side of all of this infrastructure is the capacity for all kinds of transactions to be recorded, for data about users, movements, behaviour, etc., to become part of a recorded and analysable archive. This is something that's currently being extended with new forms of instrumentation, particularly with network digital sensors around smart city strategies. So I think these different trajectories go to the heart of the complex challenge we face regarding public space and the kind of city, smart city, sentient city, that we want to inhabit in the future. On the one hand, urban digital networks are implicated in the wholesale capture of a range of previously unregistered dimensions of social life. Movement, behaviour, but also feelings, patterns of belief and so on, opinions, turning human singularities into data that hold increasing commercial value. So if you look at all the largest companies by market value in the world, they're companies like Google, Facebook, Alibaba. On the other hand, the condition that I'm talking about is Geomedia, with its low transaction costs, peer-based distribution networks and global reach, now supports new modes of transnational communication, collaboration. So for me, this is the central tension to thinking about participatory public space and the entanglement of the digital with the urban in the present. Not a utopic, idealistic idea of the digital as some kind of space apart, as it used to be talked about in the 90s, cyberspace, but one that is tightly bound up with experiences that are both embodied and mediated. And I think a question for us is, how can we use this digital infrastructure to produce dynamic public spaces that are not just for forms of urban display, for commercial display particularly, or which become labs for data gathering in the interests of commercial or managerial or security agendas, but which enable rich forms of public interaction which facilitate the learning of those kinds of social skills for cohabitation, which I think are really sorely needed in the present. So I'm going to turn over now to Nikos, who's also going to do a little bit of an introduction to this, and then we'll move into the first session around large screens.